Okay, thanks everybody for coming tonight. We're glad to have you. My name's Marcy Scott Weiss. I'm hosting this tonight. And this is Magnolia United Church of Christ January Learning Forum. It's tonight brought to you by Humanities of Washington. We'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging that we present this program from the traditional lands of the Duwamish peoples. We ask those in attendance, wherever you may be, to reflect on the traditional lands that you inhabit, to pay respect to the original stewards of those lands, and to recognize their continuing connections to them. Hold on, let me just, there. So the presentation you're about to enjoy is a part of Humanities Washington Speaker Bureau program. This is a nonprofit organization dedicated to opening minds and bridging divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. I'd encourage you to visit their website, and it's www.humanities.org, and I'll put it in the chat. A quick note on civil discourse. These programs are designed to generate an open and honest conversation on many topics, some of which may be controversial. We encourage differing points of view. We ask that you treat this topic, the speaker, and each other with respect. And also please note that this event is being recorded. So a bit about our speaker this evening. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Dr. Eric Wagner, a biologist with his PhD from the University of Washington, where he currently works and studies. He's the author of After the Blast, the Ecological Recovery of Mount St. Helens. Dr. Wagner was supposed to speak with us in October, but he had to reschedule because he had a more pressing concern of visiting penguins in Antarctica, I believe. So we're lucky to have him here tonight. Tonight, Dr. Wagner is going to be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have time for questions. So we're going to hold all questions to the end. If they come up, please feel free to start putting them in the chat. And thank you to Humanities of Washington for being here tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wagner.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Marcy, for the kind introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for hosting me, and thanks also for being willing to reschedule. Let's get started. Okay. So first I'm going to shrink myself so that I can't see myself, because that is always horrifying. Okay. So yeah, so I will be, as Marcy said, I'm talking about Mount St. Helens, and I'm going to be talking, the talk is called After the Blast, 40 Years of Lessons from Mount St. Helens. And yeah, so this is Mount St. Helens as seen from the Mount Margaret backcountry, which is a little bit about 8 miles or so northeast of the mountain. And for Pacific Northwesterners, this is a pretty iconic view, looking at Mount St. Helens. I mean, you can see the giant crater, you see the mountain, you see the sort of general grayish aspect of the landscape, but also a little bit of the green. You know, the farther away you get, you can see the trees that are coming back. You can see the trees that have been knocked over. And so you see in this landscape, you see a sort of record of the 1980 eruption. And in that way, that, you know, the 1980 eruption at Mount St. Helens is a real regional marker, in that pretty much everyone who was alive and cognizant in the Pacific Northwest and also beyond remembers where they were when they heard that the mountain had erupted. And this makes the 1980 eruption it's a very known story. It's a very familiar story. And so because of that sort of familiarity, like when I was working on the book on which this talk is based, you know, sometimes I'd be talking to folks and they'd be like, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm writing about Mount St. Helens and the eruption." And they'd say, "Oh, cool, Mount St. Helens, the eruption. What are you going to say that's new?" And for me at the time, it was all new. You know, I was reading all of the studies that had come out of the 40, you know, in the 40 odd years since the eruption, talking to all these scientists who've been working for decades, and, you know, folks who study plants and animals and fungi and lakes and trees and flowers and amphibians, and I can just go on and on and on. I mean, I was, trying to wrap my arms around all of this material. It was all too much. And so for me, it was all new. And so I'd be like, okay, I'll try to think of something new to say that you haven't heard before. And so that's kind of what I want to do with this talk is show you what's new at Mount St. Helens, show you what's happened there in the 40 years and show you the way that the mountain has kind of maybe changed a little bit from how we thought we knew it.
Hey, Eric, before you go on, could you
Yeah.
just answer where that photo is taken from?
Yeah, this photo was taken in the Mount Margaret backcountry. So it's a spot at the northern edge of the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. And I was on a trail, it's called the Boundary Trail, and it's about 8 miles or so from the mountain. So yeah, that's where the photo was taken. All right. But first I want to sort of situate the mountain for you within a sort of geological context. So Mount St. Helens sits in the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is this 25,000-mile arc of volcanic activity that stretches from the southern tip of South America, as you can see here. It kind of goes up through Central America into the Pacific Northwest, across the Aleutian chain to Russia, the Kamchatka Peninsula, down through Japan and into Indonesia and Malaysia and the Philippines before petering out in New Zealand. And so along that sort of yellowish trail, you can see all these little black triangles. Every single one of them is a volcano. And so, there are hundreds of them, lots of activity, lots of volcanoes, lots of earthquakes. And at any one time, about 400 volcanoes along the Ring of Fire are active or considered active. And so Mount St. Helens is part of the Cascade Range, which is 18 volcanoes that stretch from southern British Columbia to northern California. And so I note that this slide is from the US Geological Survey, and so apparently for them, Canada does not exist. But I assure you there are a couple of Cascade volcanoes up in southern BC. And this is a photo of Mount St. Helens from about 2016, also from a different spot in the Mount Margaret backcountry. And this should tell you that the Mount Margaret backcountry is one of my favorite places to go at Mount St. Helens. It's really amazing. But in geological terms, so Mount St. Helens is the youngest of the Cascades. It's the vent over which it sits is only about 40,000 years old. And the edifice or the prominence, or what we sort of conventionally think of as the mountain, is itself about 4,000 years old. And so in geological terms, Mount St. Helens is just a baby, but it's a real squawky baby. It's easily the most active of the Cascade volcanoes and erupts about every 140 years on average. Not that you would necessarily have known it was the most active volcano were you to look at it in the 1970s, which is when this picture was taken. At that time, Mount St. Helens was a different sort of familiar sort of component of a conventional Pacific Northwest landscape. You can see this is Mount St. Helens as just a beautiful mountain over the forest, fronted by a large lake. And the thing of Mount St. Helens, it was known for its perfection, for its beauty, its symmetry. It was called the Fuji of North America. And it owed that perfect symmetry to its youth. Glaciers hadn't had time to kind of carve up the summit into the more rumpled forms that you see at older mountains like Mount Rainier and Mount Adams. But human and geological time horizons started to converge in the spring of 1980 in March, in the middle of March, when a series of small earthquakes signaled to geologists that magma was on the move, that something was happening at Mount St. Helens, that magma was moving up into the Earth's crust, into the mountain, into the prominence. And so through March and April, magma began to build up in a chamber that formed under the northern flank of the mountain, and it began to expand. This chamber was expanding, and it became known as the bulge, and it would expand by as much as 5 feet per day. And so when this activity started to happen, there was a sort of quick sort of scientific response. Government geologists gathered at the mountain. This was one of their camps. It was called the Coldwater Observation Post. And you can see also, if you look at the mountain in the distance, it's lost some of that perfect symmetriness, that straight sort of slopishness The bulge part, the north part, is on the left side, and you can see how it's kind of, it looks a little distended. And so in addition to the bulge, there were these occasional steam and ash eruptions. And so this is a photo during one such eruption. And you can see that since it was taken in the spring, since the mountain was still covered with snow, that the snow was really gray down, several thousand feet. So this was no small amount of ash being ejected. And this is what those steam eruptions look like from the air. So while, there's the earthquakes, the small tremors, there's the bulge beginning to bulge, and there are the steam eruptions, there are planes overflights at Mount St. Helens a lot. And one of the things that they noted was the opening of a crater. There were cracks on the summit, and this small crater that opened that was a few hundred feet in diameter. Excuse me. And then suddenly in early May, everything went quiet. It just all the earthquakes stopped, the ash eruptions, the steam eruptions stopped, the bulge stopped growing, and that was that. And suddenly everybody wondered, was the mountain done? Had it done what it was going to do? And there was a sort of a sense of like, is that it? All this fuss for nothing? And then came the morning of May 18th, 1980. And so what I'm going to show you now are a series of photos taken by a fellow named Gary Rosenquist, who was camped on the east side of the mountain in a place called Bear Meadows, which is 11 miles away. And so he was out one morning. He got up, May 18th was a Sunday, and he got up and he set up his camera and he pointed it at Mount St. Helens. And at 8:27 a.m., he took this picture. And 5 minutes later, an earthquake that registered 5.1 on the Richter scale just shook the mountain, and the entire north flank rippled and churned and then collapsed. And what at the time was the largest landslide in recorded history. And so one of the consequences of that collapse, so remember there's this magma chamber in the northern face, and the magma chamber is filled with superheated water and gas and steam and all sorts of stuff. And the only thing keeping that from bursting out all over the place is the weight of the rock on top of it. So with the landslide, when these, millions of tons of rock and glacial ice just go racing away from the mountain, suddenly this magma chamber, there's nothing sitting on top of it anymore. And so everything just burst out. These giant, it's become known as sort of the lateral blast. And so all of the steam and ash and superheated water and gas just flew out over the landscape in these giant clouds that may have been traveling about 600 miles an hour. And so what this is a sort of a GIF showing a series of photos of the lateral blast sort of developing as these clouds just race out over the landscape. And it's quite a series of photos. It's one of the things that's most interesting to me about them is that I don't know who took them. At Mount St. Helens with the 1980 eruption, pretty much every photo, who the photographer was. I mean, they became famous for whatever photos they were able to take. But nobody I know, I've asked a lot of people, who took these photos? Does anybody know who took these photos? They were incredibly brave to stand wherever they were and watch these clouds come racing towards them. And they must have survived because the photos are in pretty good shape, but nobody's been able to tell me who took them. So after the landslide and the lateral blast, what happened was ash began to billow out of the exposed vent and grew in this tremendous plume, ash and pumice, that was in about 15 minutes, it had climbed 15 miles in the sky and just kept, ejecting ash for the rest of for hours. And geologists estimate that about 500 million tons of ash and pumice were burst out of the mountain that day. And so as it's happening, you can kind of get a sense of it in this photo, but prevailing winds began to blow that ash east. And what I'm showing you here is a series of a sort of an animation. There, at the time of the eruption, there was a government weather satellite perched exactly over southern Washington. And so it was taking pictures every 20 minutes. And so it took its first picture there at 8:30. And I always wonder what, if only it had waited 2 minutes. But so you see that first picture of nothing, and then nothing, and then that's 20 minutes into the eruption. And what you see is the winds are beginning to blow the ash east. And so the ash plume, I mean, it's interesting to think of the eruption of Mount St. Helens within the sort of the media landscape of the time. Because now, something like that happens, the entire world knows in about 30 seconds. But at that time, nobody was expecting it. There wasn't anybody there who could get word out very quickly. And so people in Eastern Washington and, in Spokane and Ellensburg and other places, they came out on a Sunday morning, or by then mid-morning, they looked to the west and they saw this gigantic apocalyptic dark cloud just bearing down on them. And so for many people, this was sort of the public introduction to the eruption of Mount St. Helens itself, was seeing this huge cloud of ash just kind of bearing down on their town or city and then dumping tons of material on them. So such that, kind of darkening the sky so that, streetlights went on at noon and things like that. And so the ash continued to blow around. Measurable amounts of ash were found in 17 states. And then the ash, it just kept on climbing. It climbed into the stratosphere and circled the Earth in about 2 weeks. And the last sort of process of, to say the eruption is to make it sound like a singular thing, but it was several processes. It was the landslide, it was the lateral blast, it was the ash plume. The last process of the day were these called pyroclastic flows. So this was boiling hot pumice just spilling out over the north flank of the mountain and pouring down and forming this kind of large apron in front of the mountain. And so the main eruption, the catastrophic eruption as it's known, lasted about 9 hours. And by the time it was done, Mount St. Helens had shed about 1,300 feet in elevation. And in place of that perfectly symmetrical peak, there was now a crater that was over 1 mile in diameter and 2,000 feet deep. And this is what was left from a landscape perspective. This is a composite satellite image from NASA. And so what this shows, one of the things that was really, really interesting about the eruption of Mount St. Helens is that rather than erupting out, which is, you ask any kindergartner to draw a volcano, what they do is they'll draw usually a triangle and some smoke going up, rather than erupting up, Mount St. Helens had erupted out. So the lateral blast was a sort of a directed blast. And so rather than the effects of the eruption being distributed kind of equidistantly or equitably, equally, there we go, equally around the mountain, they were concentrated in sort of the northern quadrant. And so the other thing to note is, so you can see there would be a sort of distance effect. The closer that you were to the mountain, the more powerful the processes were, the more powerful the landslide, the more powerful the lateral blast. And the farther you got away, the weaker they were. And then the other thing to think about is that these were all, as I've said, different processes. So there was a landslide, there was the lateral blast, there were these other things, and these had distinct sort of effects on the land, and that resulted in there being a number of what have come to be known as distinctive disturbance zones. And here's a slide from the Forest Service that shows those zones kind of conveniently colorized. So you can see the largest zone in the blast area is this kind of beige blowdown zone. And that's what was left behind from the lateral blast, the giant clouds racing over the land and knocking over all the trees. And that's why it's called the blowdown zone. But at the edge of the blowdown zone, you see this kind of orangish rim. And that's where by the distance from the mountain, from the, down in the bottom there to the top, the very top of the scorch zone is a distance of 17 linear miles. I mean, there's a lot of up and down in there, but as the crow flies, it's about 17 miles. And so as the lateral blast clouds are racing over the land at up to 600 miles an hour, maybe more, they're starting to, they run into hills and things, they swirl around, they lose their energy. So by the time they were getting to the edge there, they were hot enough to kill trees, but not strong enough to knock them down. And so that's why that's known as the scorch zone or the zone of standing dead. And if you drive to Mount St. Helens, if you approach on Highway 99 from the east, you can really see this very strong boundary of how far the lateral blast cloud could reach, because you'll be going along and you'll be in this nice forest, and then suddenly you'll just see this rim of snags just sort of standing sentinel pointing towards the mountain. It's quite something. It's quite an effect. And so the other two main things that I would talk about are there. You can see the yellow leading away from the mountain. That's the debris avalanche. That's where all the most of the landslide material went. This was all down the North Fork Toutle River Valley. It was buried. The river was buried by rocks and ice and mud up to about 600 feet deep in places. And then in front of the mountain is what's called the pumice plain, which is left over from the pyroclastic flows. this is the pumice that was spilling out of the over the front, the rim of the new crater on the north flank, and it buried a sort of 6 square mile parcel of land up to about 150 feet deep in scorching hot pumice. And so this is what it kind of looked like on the ground. This is a picture from the blowdown zone. You can see all the trees just knocked over as if they aren't, as if they weren't trees, just things that they look like straw. And it's interesting because, and so obviously at the time, the eruption got a lot of national attention. I mean, this was a volcano erupting in the lower 48 states next to some large urban areas. People cared about that sort of thing. And so President Jimmy Carter came to southwestern Washington to visit 4 days after the eruption. And he went and he got a tour of the mountain and the blast area by helicopter. And so he was flying out there. He was flying, they took off from Longview, a small town, gosh, I don't know, 50 or 60 miles away, maybe. And they're flying over the landscape, and President Carter is looking down out the window, and he's like marveling at this devastation. He's, oh, this is terrible. He's never seen anything. It just looks so awful. There's just this destruction. It's just wanton. And there was an official from the U.S. Forest Service there with him, and it was like, oh, Mr. President, we haven't actually reached the volcano yet. Those are clear cuts. But in due time, President Carter reached the volcano, and he was still horrified by what he saw. And he said something that sort of entered the Mount St. Helens episteme, which is the moon looks like a golf course compared to what's up there. And this is what was up there. I mean, this is the mountain a few days after the eruption. I don't play golf. I would not play golf there. But you can see just how desolate it is. I mean, it's still smoky and steamy. There's so much dust in the air that you can't see more than a few miles. And sometimes I like to look at this picture because I like to think about what it must have been like to be a scientist looking at this landscape. There were scientists fanning out all over the blast area immediately afterwards. Search and rescue efforts were underway. The eruption had killed 57 people, and there were trying to find, they were either recovery efforts or rescue efforts underway. But then there were geologists who were racing around trying to figure out if the mountain was going to erupt again. I mean, they'd been taken so by surprise with the catastrophic eruption. The mountain had been quiet. They thought it was done, and then suddenly it wasn't done. It very clearly was not done. And so, in the years since, there's come to be, as I said earlier, this kind of air of familiarity about the eruption, in the sense of like whatever folks found there, well, of course they were going to find, because that's what there was to be found. Whatever scientific lessons they drew were the only lessons that were available. But that wasn't, if you were somebody just seeing this sort of landscape for the first time, it must have just been completely overwhelming. But there was another group of folks who were interested in seeing the mountain besides the geologists, and that was some ecologists. There were some ecologists who, when the mountain had started stirring, had thought, hey, this would be a great opportunity to see what happens, when a volcano erupts, to look at its effects on the landscape, on the life. And so they had gone up beforehand and put out some plots and things. They're like, okay, we'll run a transect here. We'll count some grass. We'll count some trees. We'll wait for the mountain to erupt, and then we'll come back and we'll count the grass and count the trees again and see what happened. Well, all those places were just absolutely destroyed. I mean, there was nothing left. And so, but they were still, wanting to get in, because as you've seen, to think of that previous image, there was clearly nothing there. There's no life. It's just gray. It's just hot and dry and dead. And, for ecologists, that's actually it's an interesting scenario, because it gives you a chance to ask questions about what happens, how life comes back in the face of total devastation. It's a rare condition to find, that there's just absolutely nothing in a spot. And so they're like, okay, well, let's go in and we'll see what there is to see. They had to wait a little while, because obviously ecological research at the volcano was not the priority. But after a couple of weeks, they were able to fly. They were able to go to a place called Ryan Lake, which is about 8 miles from the mountain. And so they were flying there in a helicopter, and this is kind of what they were seeing. This picture is another one from the blowdown zone, gray, 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 trees falling over, a nice blue sky, but nothing really of note. And so they land in the helicopter. It's a forest ecologist named Jerry Swanson and an aquatic ecologist named Jim Siddell. And they land, and the safety officer opens the door and says, "Okay, out you go, but you've only got about 15 minutes because you might have to leave in a hurry." And so Jerry Franklin, the forest ecologist, hops out and looks down at his feet, at his boot, and what does he see nudging up against it but a little green shoot? And this is what that little green shoot looked like later. Jerry Franklin is a good forest ecologist, and he recognized that little shoot as a fireweed. And so this is what fireweed looks like when it's grown up. Fireweed is a classic pioneer species. It's found all over the world. You've probably seen it along a highway, in a place that's been forested. You might also have seen it in your garden. If there are gardeners out there, fireweed is sometimes desired, sometimes not. But as I said, it's a classic pioneer species in that it prefers disturbed habitats. It does very, very well there. And it gets its name fireweed in English in the United States from the fact that it's one of the first plants to return after a large forest fire. In the UK, it's sometimes called bombweed because it was one of the first plants to return to bomb craters left behind during the Blitz in World War II. And so in the sense that Mount St. Helens was perfect for fireweed, fireweed was perfect for Mount St. Helens. So what I'm going to show you here is a series of photos taken over the course of a single summer. Well, what made fireweed, excuse me, so perfect for Mount St. Helens? Well, one of the things is it grows very quickly. It can occupy a patch of land, pretty much lickety split. And then at the end of the growing season, what it does is it can produce tens of thousands of seeds. And these seeds are like little dandelion seeds, a little tuft of hairs and a seed. And so the wind can pick them up and carry them far and wide. And so in this way, fireweed can spread, miles and miles and miles without really any effort or investment on its part. And another thing that fireweed can do is regenerate. If you destroy the top of the fireweed, like the plant, if you leave any root left, and even just a little bit of root will do, fireweed will grow back just fine. And so Jerry Franklin, he realized that that was what he was seeing. He was seeing fireweed regenerating from a little bit of root. And so what he thought must have happened was there'd been a fireweed there or a patch of fireweed. And then the blowdown, the lateral blast cloud came through and tore off all the vegetation. And then that little bit of root had sprouted, and that little sprout was pushing through the ash and nudging up against his boot. And as he looked around, he realized that it wasn't just fireweed. There were all sorts of things growing in the ash. I mean, this is a picture of some huckleberry sprouts and other shrubs among the roots of a blown down tree. And here's some pearly everlasting pushing up through some cracks in the ash. And it wasn't just plants either. I mean, there were bugs flying through the air. You could see the sort of dimples of ant feet in the ash. And then there were, other places they found mounds from pocket gophers that had survived. I mean, it was just suddenly they realized, there's still a lot here. And that was not what they expected to find at all. They had expected that, the return of life to Mount St. Helens would be this decade-long, process of very, very slow, things kind of creeping in from the outside little by little in these very harsh conditions. Well, that wasn't what they were finding. What they were finding was that instead, the post-eruption biotic community, it would also come from within, inside the blast area. There was lots of stuff left, lots of survivors. And so the biological response to the eruption, it was going to be, it was unexpected, it was diverse, it was quick, and it was full of surprises. And so if they had felt that they needed to study this landscape before, they really felt it now. And so they were really, they were like, we have to set up a long-term research here. And so in part due to their efforts and those of committed, environmental advocates in Southwestern Washington, just interested parties, people who thought this was a fascinating place worth worth saving. The Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument was created by President Ronald Reagan in September of 1982. And what that did was it placed 110,000 acres, most of it north of the mountain, under protection to allow, and this is another phrase that you hear at Mount St. Helens a lot, to allow geologic forces and ecological succession to continue substantially unimpeded. And so decades of subsequent research have shown two main influences on the ecological succession at Mount St. Helens. And these are survivors of the eruption, that the ones, like the fireweed and huckleberry and other stuff that would come from within the blast area, and then colonizers that would arrive from outside the blast area and sort of the more conventional, what was more expected. And so within the survivor colonizer framework, there are two main mascots for the Mount St. Helens in 1980 eruption. The first is the pocket gopher, which is kind of the classic survivor. And the second is the prairie lupin, this flower, which is the classic colonizer. And the stories of the pocket gopher and the prairie lupin are fascinating. They're a lot of fun. And if you want to learn more about them, you can read my book, After the Blast. Because one of the things that happened is when I was working, I spent a lot of time at the mountain, doing research for the book. And there was this one fellow that I followed around a lot, and we got to know each other perhaps a little too well. And so one time I was talking to him, I was, asking, his name is Charlie, and I was talking to Charlie, and I was, asking him some question or another about pocket gophers or prairie lupin, and he heaved a heavy sigh, and he's like, "Oh, pocket gophers and prairie lupin, pocket gophers and prairie lupin. All anybody wants to talk about are pocket gophers and prairie lupin. Please talk about something else." So, in due deference to Charlie, for the rest of the talk, I will talk. The rest of the talk will cover other things that what I think of as sort of newer mascots of Mount St. Helens and interesting sort of examples of its current straits. And the first of those is the rainbow trout, which is the kind of a new colonizer. And the second is the elk, which is kind of a survivor colonizer hybrid. And I think of these as more modern mascots of the ecology of Mount St. Helens, in that each illustrates something about the contemporary state of the mountain, but also looks, kind of exposes or reveals the kind of tension that underlies the monument's purpose. If the monument's purpose was to let ecological succession continue substantially unimpeded, then the rainbow trout and the elk force us to really say what we mean when we say that phrase. And so I'm going to start with the rainbow trout. So this is the rainbow trout, Oncorhynchus micus. It's a salmonid, which means it's in the same family as the Pacific salmon, the same genus. Oncorhynchus is the same genus of like the Chinook and the coho and the sockeye, among others. And so in that, it's very familiar. It's a popular game fish. It's been introduced all over the world. So much so that some biologists call it an entirely synthetic fish, and that it's been sort of mixed and matched from its native places to places where it perhaps is less native. And so because of its global distribution, it has a large number of subspecies. Some of them, like the coastal rainbow trout, the San Pedro martir rainbow trout, which is, these are trouts that are sometimes tied to particular watersheds. Up in the right, you can see the steelhead, which is the seagoing, the anatomous sort of life history, life form of the rainbow trout, and that like the salmon, like Chinook, they breed in freshwater, they migrate out to the sea for a couple of years, and they come back to spawn. And so for me, the story of the rainbow trout is the story of Spirit Lake. So remember this picture. This is Spirit Lake pre-eruption. Before the eruption, before 1980, it was a pretty typical Pacific Northwest mountain lake in that it was clear, it was deep, it was nutrient poor, or as we would sometimes say, oligotrophic. But you can also see, now I would point you to, rather than the mountain, on the lake itself, all those boats. It was a very popular recreation spot. There were cabins all along its shores, some lodges, I think an odd scout camp or two. And so, it was a great place to be in the summers. I mean, why wouldn't it be? You're at this gorgeous lake with this gorgeous mountain. So this is Spirit Lake post-eruption. As you can see, much changed. Spirit Lake has the distinction of catching perhaps the mountains, the full sort of force of the mountain's eruption. So I talked about the landslide, the debris avalanche, which started the whole thing. There's the earthquake and then the whole north flank collapses. Well, I made it sound like this kind of singular entity, but realize what it was the landslide. The North Lake collapsed in three distinct blocks. And so there was one block that went down, another block that went kind of over, and then the big block that went down the North Fork, Toutle River Valley and buried the river. But that first block went straight north pretty much and hit Spirit Lake. And it may have hit the lake so hard that for a moment all of the water was thrown out of the lake. And so that raises an interesting proposition because you can see in this picture this sort of whitish skim on the lake surface. And those are thousands and thousands and thousands of logs. Now, where did those logs come from? Well, this is when you think back to the processes. So there's the debris avalanche. The debris avalanche happens, it's going at about 150 miles an hour, all those tons of rocks and ice rumbling down the mountain, rumble, rumble, rumble. Spirit Lake's about 3 miles from the mountain. 150 miles is pretty fast. 150 miles per hour is pretty quick. But remember, the lateral blast cloud was traveling 600 miles an hour, and it was hot on the debris avalanche's heels. So the debris avalanche is rumbling down at now we consider a pokey 150 miles an hour, while the lateral blast clouds go racing across the landscape. So they overtake the landslide, pass it. What they do when they hit all those hills is they knock down all the trees. Everything is flattened. Okay, then the landslide hits the lake. All the water's thrown up. As it comes back into the basin, it gathers up all those trees and dirt and dead animals and everything, drags it all back down. And so that's where the log mat came from. The other changes to the lake that were very significant were that its bottom was raised up 200 feet by all of the rock and debris, which in turn nearly doubled its surface area from 1,300 acres to about 2,200 acres. And then, of course, as I've said, the log mat. So this is a very, very different lake. And this is what it looked like to a researcher, somebody standing on its shores. This is Jim Siddell, I think, who I mentioned earlier. He's in a helicopter, a safety suit, kind of staring at his feet, perhaps in despair, because the lake was pretty ugly. I mean, the water had gone from being very clear to just black by being full of dirt and everything. It was stinky. It was also full of anaerobic bacteria because there was no oxygen in it. And the other thing that it was full of was some pathogens. Folks who were doing research at Spirit Lake spoke of, in the first couple of summers, they got kind of sick. They'd get a fever, they'd get a cough, they feel crummy. And they jokingly called it red zone fever for whatever it was. It turned out that they had a version of Legionnaire's disease because there were two new species of Legionella bacteria discovered at Spirit Lake that were named Legionella spiritensis and Legionella St. Helensi to commemorate their origins. But the dynamics of Spirit Lake would be almost completely the opposite of what was happening on land. So, I talked about the quick response. There were plants coming up, but even a plant, it's going to take a little while for all those plants to cover all those acres. But at Spirit Lake, the eruption happened in spring and the water got really dirty and cloudy and full of nasty stuff. But, this is still the Pacific Northwest, and in the fall and winter, what happens? Well, it starts to rain and snow. And so the water started to clear pretty quickly at the lake. So what this shows are two samples. The one on the left is from August of 1980. You can see it's, quite dark. By May of 1981, just a year after the eruption, the lake had cleared quite a bit. So much so that by 1982, phytoplankton and zooplankton, basically the microscopic building blocks of any, functioning food web, were back in the lake. And by 1983, it was totally clear. So this is Spirit Lake circa 2004. You can see it's back to being blue. It's back to being beautiful. And so this is, you would say, oh, perhaps Spirit Lake has recovered. But you've got to be careful using the word recovery at Mount St. Helens because to say that something is recovered is to imply that it is returned to a previous state. But that wasn't true at Spirit Lake. This was a new lake. Functionally, for all intents and purposes, this was a different lake than the one that had been there on May 17th, 1980. It had moved from being nutrient poor to nutrient rich, or as folks would say, oligotrophic to eutrophic. And as a consequence, because of all those nutrients, there were now more plants in the lake. Then, because there were more plants, there were more aquatic invertebrates. There were more organisms. So more than just its physical transformation, there was a biological transformation at Spirit Lake. But as the lake cleared, biologists, state biologists especially, wanted to know about one type of organism in particular, and these were fish. So this is a picture. What this picture shows is a biologist at a different lake, another lake in the Mount Margaret backcountry. And what he has done is the day before, he's flown up in a helicopter and put out a gill net in the lake, and he's baited it with chicken or tuna, and he's coming back to check it. And you can see he caught some fish. How did these fish get up into this high mountain lake, you might ask? Well, there is a history and tradition in the Pacific Northwest of stocking lakes with trout. And these are brook trout that were stocked. Spirit Lake had been stocked with rainbow trout. It had, since the early, I think, 1930s, the state Fish and Game Agency had been planting, as they say, 40,000 rainbow fingerlings in Spirit Lake every single year. And so, there was like, well, what happened to the fish around Mount St. Helens? It turned out that in many of the lakes, fish had survived. Like at this one. How had they survived? Well, it comes back kind of to the timing of the eruption, which had been in the early spring. So in the early spring, many of these high elevation lakes were still covered with ice and snow. And so the ice and snow protected the fish from the worst effects of the eruption. You can see in sort of the top sliver of the photograph all the down trees. So this was a place that definitely got hit by the lateral blast clouds. But the lake itself, being shielded with ice, the fish there were okay. They might have been aware of some, rattling and shaking, and then maybe there was a period of darkness, but then, they survived. They weren't doing especially well. They weren't the fattest, happiest trout you've ever seen, but they had survived. Now, the same could not be said for any of the trout in Spirit Lake, just to be very clear about that. There was no question of finding a surviving trout in Spirit Lake because Spirit Lake had been more hammered than all the other lakes, between all the rocks, between losing all of its oxygen for months. There was no way that anything that needed oxygen, like a fish, could survive. But humans are a hopeful species, and you never know. So folks were doing fish surveys of Spirit Lake, pretty much, within a couple of years of the eruption. They were going up there, they were throwing out gill nets, they were drawing in empty gill nets. There weren't any fish there. But then in 1993, there was a fish. There was a rainbow trout that was found. So probably it had established a couple of years before that. So they were out they caught the Washington Department of Fish and Game, now the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Some biologists from WDFW caught a male trout, and he was 8 inches long and weighed about a quarter of a pound, and they duly named him Harry after Harry R. Truman, who was the owner of the Mount St. Helens Lodge and had famously refused to evacuate in the lead into the eruption and had died when the debris avalanche buried him and his lodge under many hundreds of feet of rock. So in the next year, they went back out in 1994 and they caught a female this time. And she was even bigger. She was 18 inches long and weighed 2 3/4 pounds. And so they named her Harriet. And so after that, after 1990, from, the early 90s, they would keep returning. They kept surveying. They would catch a few rainbow every year. But finally in 2002, the big year, what this picture shows is biologist Bob Lucas in the front and John Weinheimer behind. They're just coming back from one of their surveys. You can see all the trout that they've caught. And as Bob Lucas would say, 2002 was the year they knew that Spirit Lake had finally turned a corner. And so what made the Spirit Lake rainbows so special is they were big and they were bitey. They were some of the largest rainbow trouts found anywhere in the world, real lunker trout. The average rainbow at Spirit Lake was 2 feet long and weighed 4 pounds. Now, where were they from? What were their origins? That was a bit of a mystery, actually. The again, I return to history here, where there is a history of people stocking fish in high mountain lakes. And so the general consensus is that probably at some point somebody hiked up a bucket full of fish and dumped it in the lake, or actually probably many people hiked up buckets full of fish and dumped them in the lake. And it took a few years, but these rainbows have established. There's another theory that maybe they actually recolonized on their own. There was a period in the early 80s when a lake, or excuse me, a stream, a creek that had been connected from the North Fork Toutle River to Spirit Lake and had become disconnected by the eruption, had maybe periodically reconnected, had briefly reconnected. And the steelhead, which remember are former rainbow trout, the steelhead that live in the North Fork Toutle, maybe a few of them made it to Spirit Lake and established there and then changed their life history and became rainbows. They don't know for sure. But suffice it to say, there were rainbow trouts in Spirit Lake and, Spirit Lake's within the monument. And in the monument, there's a research mandate. And so folks studied them. There were a lot of questions about the rainbow trouts of Spirit Lake. What are they eating? Where are they spawning? And what they found was that the rainbows were treating Spirit Lake kind of like an ocean, in that they would, hatch as young trouts in some of the tributary streams. They would migrate down to Spirit Lake, spend a few years there, and then migrate back up to their streams when it was time for them to spawn. And what were they eating? Well, they were eating many of the aquatic invertebrates that had been able to live in Spirit Lake because of its new nutrient richness. So they were eating a lot of small snails, for instance. People doing diet studies of them would see that the chins of the trouts were kind of abraded, and they figured that that was from them swimming along the bottom of the lake, kind of sucking up food. Or they would find their bellies with just large pieces of vegetation in them. And what they figured was that the trout, would come up and eat a whole, plant stalk to get the snails that were on it. But the other thing they found was that the rainbows were starting to shrink. So this was in 2005. By 2005, they were decreasing by a pretty steady amount of length and a steady mass. So they're just getting smaller and smaller, smaller. This, even though there were more and more rainbows. So if you were to take all of the rainbows trouts out of Spirit Lake in 2002 and weigh them, then they would weigh the same if you took all of the Spirit Lake trouts out of uh, Spirit Lake in 2005 and weighed them. They were just more smaller fish. And so because of that change from going from being big lunker trout to these smaller things, that there became to be this kind of public pressure for people to be able to fish at Spirit Lake. Because what happened was, the state folks, when they went up to do their surveys, sometimes they'd bring their friends with them to volunteer. And so you'd get people who got a chance to fish at Spirit Lake. And then they would go back to wherever they lived and they would tell their fishing buddies about the amazing trout there at Spirit Lake, and you should really get in on this if you can. And, they're like, well, why can't we go fish at Spirit Lake? We used to fish at Spirit Lake before the eruption. What's wrong with it now? Well, the U.S. Forest Service, which is the agency that manages the monument, which includes Spirit Lake, has so far said no. Because there is only one trail that leads from the road to Spirit Lake, and it's a mile long and it's really steep. But the real problem is its safety concerns, because, woe betide the fisher who's so focused on reeling in the trout if they're in a little boat that they don't notice that their boat has been completely encircled by giant floating logs and that they are about to get crushed, which is what happened actually to some researchers who are out on a boat doing, taking samples of lake, something or other with the lake. They got focused on their task, as researchers often will, and then by the time they looked up, they were completely trapped in their boat, and they had to call for a helicopter to come pluck them off before the logs crushed their craft. And you can't have that with the general public. So there is no fishing at Spirit Lake for the time being, and there seems to be there will be no fishing for the foreseeable future. And so this here is a picture. Oh, wait, this is a person fishing? No, this is a scientist doing a hook and line survey. Please don't call it fishing. But this is this is one of the reasons this picture kind of shows why I like to think of the trout as that the rainbow trout is that mascot of a new ecology, because where the pocket gopher and the prairie lupin are these kind of explicitly ecological entities, the rainbow trout is considerably more complicated in the sense that it was introduced to the mountain pre-eruption by people, and then killed all of them in the eruption. The mountain effectively cast the rainbow trout out before it was brought back, presumably by humans. And now its presence prompts a debate about the value of the landscape and the monument within the landscape. What and who is it meant for? The scientists have been there for 40 odd years doing their thing. Maybe it's time to let the public back to do their thing too, in what used to be this popular recreational space. But more sort of philosophically, the rainbow trouts ask, in the monument, which is this place for nature to basically ecological succession to happen unimpeded, this place for nature to be nature, if you will, what is natural? What is unnatural? Is the rainbow trout natural or unnatural? Is it sort of both? Is it neither? And these are difficult questions, and I sure don't have an answer for them. So let's move on. From the rainbow trout to the elk, the new survivor slash colonizer. So this is a bachelor herd of elk on the Pumice Plain. You can see, well, they are very confident in their bachelorness. But elk in the eruption, how did they fare? They did not do very well. So elk are, in management speak, sort of above ground fauna or surface dwelling wildlife. And so they were much more vulnerable than a lot of the small things like pocket gophers or toads or other stuff that could just sort of bury themselves in the ground or hide out in little tunnels and let the eruption sweep over their head. If you're an elk, you don't have a burrow. If you're an elk, you just get killed. And so biologists have estimated that about 1,500 elk were killed in the 1980 eruption, to go with about 5,000 black-tailed deer, 200 black bears, and some unknown number of cougars and bobcats. So because of this, because of the sort of wholesale waste that happened to whatever elk was within reach of the eruption, the scientific approach to them would be different. There'd be no tales of plucky survivors or anything like that, but you could learn from the dead, specifically from the locations of their bodies. So what this picture shows is an elk skeleton that's been dug out of the blast deposits in the debris avalanche area. And so you can see, it's quite intact. And folks who did this sort of work likened it to the people who worked at Pompeii, which is the town that was right at Mount Vesuvius, that was buried when Mount Vesuvius erupted, and you ended up with all these casts of people who were killed sort of in mid-flight. And so there were two biologists at the University of Washington who were interested in doing a study specifically on elk calving grounds. So one element of elk natural history that you may or may not know is that come time for breeding, the male elk, the bull elk, form these harems. You'll get a male elk and some number of females that he considers to be under his control, that he will impregnate. But after a while, when the pregnant females are getting ready to give birth, they tend to separate themselves from the main herd. And they probably do this to, for the sake of protection, because it's a lot harder to find a single elk than it is to find 70 elk that are all hanging out together. But the question was, where do they go? What sort of habitats does a pregnant elk prefer when she's about to give birth? Well, this was in the pre-GPS tags day, but when you could just stick some tiny little a tag on an animal and count on a satellite to tell you where it was. Well, there were basically two ways to find out where an animal was going if you weren't actively following it. What you could do is capture it, put a radio collar on it, and then send some hapless technician up to an exposed point with an antenna to listen for the beep, 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 beep that would tell you where the elk kind of was. Or you could wait for a volcano to erupt and kill everything where they lay, and then pick through the remains and then map the remains to see, oh, this was here in a meadow. This one was here at the fringe of some trees. And in that way, you'd be able to outline elk, what the pregnant females preferred. Because one of the things is they could tell which elks had been pregnant, because sometimes they would find these skeletons that had a tiny little skeleton inside it. There'd be a big adult skeleton, and then within that skeleton was this other skeleton, which was the unborn fetus, or nearby the big adult skeleton, there'd be a much smaller skeleton just sort of, very close to it, and that was inferred to be the young calf. And so in this way, they were able to sort of map out where the pregnant elk, the female elks, had been before they gave birth. And so this is what this picture shows is that remnant of that study. This is so the Mount St. Helens elk herd in the off-site storage facility of the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture at the University of Washington in Seattle. Each of those boxes contains up to 4 elk skeletons. It's quite a kind of macabre scene, but also strangely redolent of Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, because you go to this place at the Burke and you find all these wonderful things just stacked on shelves. But the one thing is that a lot of elk actually survive. So 1,500 dead elk sounds like a lot of dead elk, but the Mount St. Helens elk herd as a management entity has about 10,000 individuals, and many of them survived outside the blast area, in some cases just outside the blast area. So this is a picture of some elk wandering around the blast area, shortly after the eruption. And you can see, if you can read it down in the corner, this picture was taken by a scientist named Evelyn Merrill. And she was a graduate student at the University of Washington when Mount St. Helens erupted and had been working at Mount Rainier on elk, but then Mount St. Helens erupted. And so she started working on elk at Mount St. Helens. And she was telling me these stories. So she would be in this valley and she'd look up and on this ridge, she'd see these elk looking down at her. And there would be something just a little bit off about their silhouettes. And so she'd get some binoculars and kind of look up at them. And what she saw was that they didn't have any ears. Their ears had been burned off by the blast cloud. They'd been right at the edge of the scorch zone, so that they'd lost their ears, but they'd survived. And so elk, being large and highly mobile creatures, they were quick to come back to the blast area. And so what drew them? Well, they were drawn to the blast area by plants, by things like fireweed. Here's some fireweed on the west side of Mount St. Helens. And in this, fireweed, Evelyn Merrill told me that fireweed is like elk ice cream, and that it's rich and nutritious and just a little bit bad for you. The surviving plants like fireweed and other stuff provided these high quality summer forage. And in the winter, what the elk would subsist on were plants that had been scattered by the soil conservation services to help control erosion. So in the summer, they would feast on the survivors, and in the winter, they would feast on stuff that managers had planted to try to keep the dirt from roaring away, but it didn't really work. So, their numbers in the blast area increased pretty rapidly. This is a picture of a mixed herd of elk in the debris avalanche deposits. And in 1981, there were about 200 elk they counted that kind of would make these little tentative forays into the blast area. But by 1985, it was more than 600. That number had tripled to 600 elk that were going deeper and deeper into what was now the monument. And so elk were a real benefit at first for plants. This is a nice big picture of elk droppings. The elk poop was provided fertilizer for new plants. You can see amongst these droppings are some prairie lupin that are growing. And they're also seed transport. Elk eat a lot of stuff and then they poop out the seeds, and then the seeds can grow. And then the elk themselves, their bodies, they catch seeds on their fur and carry seeds that way. And so the elk, it wasn't just carrying seed transport. They were breaking up the ash. So elk tracks, their hooves are hard and sharp, and so they would walk through the ash and they would break it up, and so they exposed the old soils that were underneath. And in that, if a seed was lucky enough to fall in this sort of track that you see here, where the elk had been walking, they would have readier access to older soils rather than landing in ash, which was a little more inhospitable for plants. And the elk, they can also range far and wide. You see this trail just sort of going off into the distance towards Mount St. Helens. So in this way, they would stitch, they would create these troughs all throughout the blast area that plants could grow in. But success for the elk came at a cost. So as their numbers were increasing, they were beginning to run into the landscape's kind of carrying capacity, and that there wasn't enough food. And so in the winters especially, elk would starve. The sort of Washington, the WDFW started doing winter kill surveys in 1999. They'd find that as many as 150 elk would starve during the harshest winters. And so starving elk, these stories of starving elk began to move. They reached beyond the boundaries of the monument to the surrounding communities. Mount St. Helens, it's pretty close to Portland, and so the Portland TV stations would do these segments about starving elk. They'd show these these horrible videos of elk that are, completely emaciated, their skin stretched taut across their ribs, so weak to barely, they can barely stand up. And this was pretty upsetting. I mean, these were difficult images to see. And because, folks were, they understood the monument was a place for nature to take its course, but nobody liked to see nature taking its course quite like that. And so in response to public interest, there were these sort of food supplement program, winter supplemental feeding programs began. Different state agencies would provide hay and things for elk, and these efforts continue to this day. I mean, in 2019, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation gave over $310,000 in grants for habitat enhancement, which is basically kind of feeding. And in Skamania County, one of the counties in which Mount St. Helens sits, the county treats over 1,200 acres of meadows on the south end of the national forest for elk, putting food out for them. And so, the feeding really helped the elk herd stabilize. And as the elk herd at Mount St. Helens has stabilized, their influence on succession has also begun to change. And so what this picture shows is a tree growing in the debris avalanche zone near hummocks, which is a trailhead on the west side of the mountain, excuse me. And so this tree probably looks a little funny to you, and that's because the top of it looks like you'd expect any sort of fir to look, but the bottom has been heavily browsed by elk. And so there are a couple of significances to this picture because the return of trees, the return of of evergreens, of firs and hemlock and cedar and things like that is sort of the final stage of plant succession. By the time you're getting trees, you're nearing what used to be called the kind of climax community. But if these trees are growing and the elk are eating them so much so that they die before they can mature, that's not so good. The other thing that elk do is, I would redirect your attention to this picture. What before I was talking about how their trampling was good because they were breaking up the ash. But if you look at this picture a little more closely, what you see is that this particular game trail is going through a bunch of vegetation like moss and grasses and things like that. And so as the plants were returning to kind of cover the ground, the elk were walking through them and tearing them all up. And one biologist told me that a herd of elk can set succession back about 10 years. A herd of elk just walking through an area can set it back about 10 years when it comes to getting plants. And this was definitely, to set something back 10 years is definitely succession interrupted, but is it succession impeded in the sense of what the monument says, where its succession is supposed to take place substantially unimpeded? And so people stepped in, not for the first time. The first elk hunt at Mount St. Helens was in 1982, and it was ironically that hunt that drove the elk into the area that would become the monument, because the hunt had taken place on the sort of outer rim of what would become the monument boundary, and then all the elk that were there were like, okay, we'll go into the monument. And so to try to get them out, the federal biologists who work at the monument were like, well, we should have another elk hunt. And they were thinking this in 2005. What their plan was, their hope was, is they would have a single hunt for a year. They would allow, they'd sell tags. It would be a special thing. People could go into the monument and hunt, which normally you can't do. They'd go into the heart of the monument. They'd drive the elk out to the outskirts where they would go into the sort of what remained of the pre-eruption forest, and they could go live their lives there and everything would be fine. It didn't work out quite that way. What happened was they went to the state game agency, which basically controls the hunt, said, here's what we want to do, single hunt, heart of the monument, drive the elk out. The state said, great, sounds like an interesting idea. Here's what we'll do instead. We'll have a hunt on the rim of the monument. We'll have it every year. And so because of that, the elk, elk aren't stupid. They know that if they're in the monument, they're not going to get shot. And so they've been hanging out in the monument for basically the last 2 decades, and they show no signs of leaving. And so this, to kind of close this section, I wanted to end with this picture because this is a bull elk bugling on the Pumice Plain, and it's one of the most. I don't know how many of you have heard elk bugling. It's a tremendous, haunting, beautiful sound, and the Pumice Plain is one of the best places to hear it because you're up high, but there are no trees, so the sound the elk bugling can just carry for miles. And I have some of my favorite memories of being at Mount St. Helens or being out on the Pumice Plain hiking somewhere, and you just hear the high bugle coming, it's a long way, but somehow it still reaches your ears. And so I mean, it's a neat thing because I think of the elk as being a real test on that phrase, ecological succession substantially unimpeded, because unimpeded by whom? Unlike the rainbow trout, the elk were a natural part of the landscape. They were there before the eruption. They came back entirely on their own without, human aid. And, what they do, and what I think this is interesting is I think one of the reasons that people find elk so kind of nettlesome at Mount St. Helens is because they show the pretension, if you will, of drawing a line in a landscape in a dynamic space like Mount St. Helens and saying, on this side of the line, it's going to be this way, and on this side of the line, it's going to be that way, and never the twain shall meet. But elk really, kind of laugh in the face of that idea because they kind of stitch those two spaces together. They go out of the monument to get food. They come back into the monument to eat the fireweed. They go out of the monument in the winter, and they come back in the spring to get away from hunters or whatever. And as they do that, as I said, they stitch these places together. But what they also do, I mean, turning back to this picture, is they show how Mount St. Helens will always remain this really beautiful and complicated place. And so what I want to close with is a time lapse of Mount St. Helens over the years, starting in 1979, and to sort of think back to the original, my motivating question: what do we learn? What have we learned at Mount St. Helens? What's new about the eruption story? So what have we learned? Well, we learned that things can come back, that life will return, that it will return in faster than you thought, that it's resilient even in the face of a seemingly unfathomable disaster, that life it's just full of surprises too. It hides in little pockets. It lurks in little dark spaces. It is much bolder and more resourceful than even people who thought it was bold and resourceful realized. But the other thing, the flip side of that, is that life may come back quickly, but it may not come back as you expect it to, or even want it to. And then you have to decide how you feel about that. The Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument is a management space. This is a place for that people manage. And so in saying, hey, we'll just leave it alone, well, then sometimes things happen that, clearly when you were leaving it alone, you were expecting it to do one thing and it did another. How do you feel about that? Do you try to get it back to what you think it should be doing? And as before, these are complex questions for which there are no easy answers. But the other thing that I like about Mount St. Helens is the lesson. I think one of the main lessons that people have taken away, that one of the main lessons that the mountain has taught us is the value of looking. What I really admire is that, 40 years, more than 40 years now, almost 44 years ago now, a bunch of people saw this mountain erupt and thought, let's just watch, let's see what happens. Let's learn what we can learn by following these things through time. And that to do nothing is sometimes really, really bold. And I admire the boldness of that. And so one of the things that I think is really neat, what's really exciting about Mount St. Helens, is a lot of the folks who started working there in 1980, they're retired now. They're handing off their studies to a new crop of scientists who will bring their own sort of morals and ethics and techniques to this space. And I always like to think, oh, I wonder what the person who writes the next book in 40 years at the 80th, say, anniversary of the 1980 eruption, I wonder what they will find then. So that's it. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. If you're interested in learning more, if I haven't bored you to tears, you can find my book, After the Blast. It's around, it's at the library, it's at various bookstores. Yeah, and you can read it. So thanks, and I will now stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was just wonderful. And thank you for everybody for sticking in there. Eric, there's one question in the chat. Did the
Uh-huh.
elk's ears grow back? And did their offspring have ears?
Their elk's ear, the ones that were burned off did not grow back, but the offspring had ears. It was like an injury, it'd be like if you lost a finger in a saw accident. You don't get your finger back, but your kids hopefully will have all their fingers.
And I direct everybody who's on, there's a survey in the chat comment. If you could grab that and give Scott Eric some feedback on the presentation tonight, that would be great. and affirm what a wonderful time it was.
Thank you. This is actually, I will say, this is my very last one
Oh,
because my term is done. We are doing this special because I had to reschedule in October. So you can really be honest if you want. You can be like, that was terrible. And my feelings will be hurt, but nothing will change.
okay, so lots of compliments for you about how informative it was, interesting it was. The question is there going to be better funding for the visitor center and major disrepair?
That is an excellent question. I don't know. I would say probably not. The if that's a really that is a question that opens a big old can of worms because one of the current issues at Mount St. Helens right now is people feel like it's not being visited enough, that the visitor experience is a little wanting. And part of that is because as a monument, it's run by the Forest Service and the Forest Service doesn't have a lot of sort of visitor experience, if you will. And so, I think, I like JRO, the Johnson Ridge Observatory. I think it's great. But yeah, it doesn't get a lot of money. It's closed right now because the road washed out, and that's the road to it washed out. And so that's making, there's no timetable for reopening. There's a movement afoot to try to get Mount St. Helens, to get the Forest Service to kind of give up Mount St. Helens and give it to the National Park Service, and so then it would become a national park instead of a national monument. Um, that would lead to some interesting changes. I mean, it'd be a different visitor experience there. There'd be a lot more sort of infrastructure. That question, it touches on a lot of the tensions at Mount St. Helens because, one of the things is that, before 1980, it was just a recreational mountain. It wasn't a place that people studied that much. There was a lot of private forestry and public, it was private forest land was there. And then after the eruption, there was a lot of trading of lands. Weyerhaeuser owned a lot of land. They gave the land to the Forest Service to make the monument in return for other patches of land elsewhere. And so, but there's a lot of like the surrounding communities, like in Longview and Kelso, they're like, it would be great if we had, say a road that goes through that would get people, so it isn't just an out and back, but it could be a loop. Um, there are a lot of it's a tricky question and there's a lot of strong feelings about it. So
Okay,
yeah,
let me give you another one.
sure.
What did the gopher eat? And did it dig its way up through many feet of debris to get to the surface? How did it survive?
So gophers, I mean, there was a lot of root nodules. There were a lot of roots hanging down in the ground, and that's tends to be what they eat. Um, so I hinted at this a little bit, but now I can say it explicitly. So one of the things, I talked a bit about the ice on the lakes, but that meant that a lot of the ground was covered with snow. And so the gophers were kind of under the snow, in their tunnels under the snow, and that protected them. And so they would eat, they live under the snow all winter, without really knowing what's going on. And so they didn't really know what was happening. The interesting thing, so one of the things that's really interesting is about gophers is they really facilitated the return of plants because in all their tunneling, they would mix up the soil and the ash and bring, if you looked at these patches, if you compared the species diversity of plants around a gopher hill, a gopher mound, to an area with no gophers, there were always way more plants around the gophers because they aerated the soil. They were really, the gophers were good. I know a lot of folks, who get gophers in their garden are less than thrilled. But if you have a gopher at a volcano, then that's something to cheer and support.
Okay, and I think I know this answer. What is your specialty? You are a biologist, correct?
I am a biologist. I actually study seabirds and penguins, as you alluded to earlier. That is my stock and trade, but I like the mountains a lot. I really like, an editor came to me, hey, do you want to write about Mount St. Helens? And I said, you bet. It was a real learning process for me. I'm not a plant guy, and this was a lot about plants. And so the learning curve was steep. Maybe not as steep as it could have been, but
Okay, here's
yeah.
a plant question then.
Okay. Uh-oh.
What will be the long-term future of the forest that is all the same age?
That's a good question. So one of the things that's neat about Mount St. Helens is that now, now the trees are coming back. Now you're reaching that final, the trees are getting old. They're starting to kind of march back up the mountain. Um, the interesting, so Jerry Franklin has a lot of really cool things to say about the trees at Mount St. Helens because the mountain erupts frequently enough, like every 140 years, which is, 2 human lifetimes, but is well within a single Doug fir, like an old Doug fir might live through 2 or 3 eruptions, and if it's 600 or 700 years old. And so then you start to think of Mount St. Helens as having a kind of selection pressure, as shaping the trees that can live on it. Maybe they have thicker bark. Maybe they can do this. Maybe they can do that. And so the there will always be, the forests will come back. They've come back before. They will come back again. And within them, you'll see the same kind of patches that form in any forest, once the big trees are there, they'll start falling down, they'll start getting old and dying. And so in addition to those dynamics, you'll have the mountain occasionally erupting and knocking everything down. But no, it's neat to think of the relationship between a mountain, a volcano, an active volcano, and its forest. The trees are so patient, and the mountain is a little, the mountain is also patient. And so these sort of century-long rhythms of trees kind of going up and coming back and going up. I mean, like waves almost. It's a cool thought.
Hmm. Okay, any comments on the stone helenite created from the blast?
I love that. Yes, Helenite is one of my favorite stones. So some warehouse, the founding of Helenite, for those who don't know, is that there were big salvage logging operations at Mount St. Helens immediately afterwards, and that meant that there was some acetylene torches at work, and the Weyerhaeuser folks, in using the acetylene torches, sometimes they would notice that there would be this kind of green glass left behind, and that was the ash that had melted, and it was green because of its impurities. And so that came to be known as kind of Helenite. And you can go on eBay or other places and find Helenite jewelry. If any of you are looking for gifts this upcoming Valentine's Day, don't be fooled though. I mean, it is just green glass, but it's cool to know that it's from Mount St. Helens. I actually personally don't own any Helenite. That is what is missing from my life. But if I found some, I'd be thrilled.
And here's one for me. When we were down there, it was very clear the cone was rising up through the center.
Yes.
Can you say what that is and what it will turn into?
So that's going to be the new summit. That's the new dome. That's, there was, when I was saying Mount St. Helens erupts every 140 years, it actually erupted again in 2004. If I don't know if folks were around then, but they remember it was a dome, what's called a dome building eruption. So not all eruptions are the same in that they're not all massive landscape altering events. Sometimes it's just magma extruding from the center and building, building, building. And if you wait a few thousand more years, that'll become the nice peaked top of the new mountain. And that's, but we'll have to wait a long time. But yeah, it's neat watching it rise. I mean, that's one of the neat things, actually. If you watch the time lapse that I showed at the end, you can see it as kind of a little nub starting in the start. The dome building happened pretty soon after the main eruption, popped up, then it was quiet, then it's really filled up. I think the new dome is about 1,000 feet tall. So I think it has reached, in places it's pretty close to the crater rim, the dome itself. And then it'll grow up and it'll fill and the crater will be gone and it'll be part of the new sort of geological story at Mount St. Helens.
Hmm. Okay, Eric, I just want to say there are so many wonderful compliments for you
Oh,
at the
thanks.
presentation. Very interesting. Lots of thanks. People really,
Oh,
really enjoyed both the presentation and how you presented it. So I consider us very lucky that we got to be your last one. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and doing this
oh,
tonight.
my pleasure. And I appreciate that you were able to reschedule.
No worries.
I'm glad that I still got to talk to y'all.
Good. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming tonight and I'll wish you well. Good night.
All right. Good night, everyone.